The crowd froze in disbelief as a police officer slammed a man onto the scorching pavement, rage burning in his eyes. Cameras captured every painful moment of humiliation for the decorated Navy SEAL veteran. But what happened next shocked everyone and changed both their lives forever. Let's start from the beginning. Officer Jason Hart had a reputation, and not the good kind. He was the type of cop who saw his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to scan for weakness, Hart thrived on control. He lived for that moment when people's faces twisted in fear at the sight of him, when they knew he held the power. It made him feel important, powerful, even though deep down he knew that without the badge, he was nothing. Years of being overlooked and outshined had left him bitter, angry at a world that had given him nothing. He took that anger out on those who couldn't fight back, minorities, immigrants, anyone who seemed like an easy target. That's why, when he saw Darnell Jackson sitting in a sleek black sports car in a suburban neighborhood, his first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. Darnell was a tall, well-built African-American man with a clean-cut look that screamed discipline. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, but the way he carried himself made him stand out. Confidence, strength. It was written in his posture. Hart hated that. He hated when people didn't immediately show fear. Hart flipped on his lights and pulled up behind the car. Darnell sighed as he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He had been here before, too many times. He rolled down the window calmly as Hart approached, hand resting on his holster. "License and registration," Hart barked. "Sure, officer," Darnell said, his tone polite but guarded. He handed over the documents without hesitation. Hart glanced at the paperwork, then narrowed his eyes. "Where'd you get this car?" Darnell frowned. "I bought it." "Don't play with me," Hart's voice sharpened. "Step out of the car." Darnell's jaw tightened. "Officer, is there a problem?" Hart yanked the door open. "Out! Now!" Reluctantly, Darnell stepped out, hands raised slightly. Without warning, Hart grabbed him by the arm and shoved him down onto the blistering pavement. Gasps erupted from the crowd gathering on the sidewalk. People pulled out their phones. "Hey, what are you doing?" someone shouted. Darnell gritted his teeth as his cheek pressed against the burning pavement. Memories of combat flashed through his mind, being pinned down under enemy fire, the heat of sand and blood. But this was different. He wasn't overseas. He was home. And the enemy wore a badge. Hart planted a knee into Darnell's back, smirking as he reached for his handcuffs. "Yeah, let's see how tough you are now." And as the crowd watched in horrified silence, Darnell's eyes burned. Not with fear, but with controlled fury. The video exploded online within hours. It spread like wildfire across social media. Officer Hart, kneeling on the back of a black Navy SEAL, face pressed against the pavement, handcuffs biting into his wrists. The hashtags started almost immediately. #Justice for Darnell. #Hold him accountable. #Stop the abuse. Major news networks picked up the footage, dissecting it from every angle. Commentators argued over the legality, but the people knew the truth. It was about race, about power, about a man who had served his country being treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. Darnell sat at home, his phone vibrating endlessly with calls and messages. Friends, fellow SEALs, and even strangers reached out with support. His brothers in arms, men he had fought alongside in Afghanistan, were furious. "We don't let our own get treated like this," one of them had said over the phone. But that didn't erase the humiliation. Darnell still saw Hart's face every time he closed his eyes, felt the heat of the pavement, the sting of the handcuffs. It wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the betrayal. He had spent his life fighting for a country that claimed to value freedom and justice. He had watched friends die on foreign soil defending those values. And now, back on American soil, those same values seemed like a joke. Hart didn't see a veteran. He didn't see a man. He saw a threat. Darnell sat in the dim light of his kitchen, scrolling through his phone. A message from one of his former teammates caught his eye. "Time to fight back." He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this slide. He had spent too many years fighting for justice overseas to ignore injustice at home. Later that night, a reporter from a major news network called. "Would you be willing to tell your side of the story?" Darnell hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He hated the spotlight. In the SEALs, it was never about the individual. It was about the team. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about something bigger. He answered the call. "Yeah," he said. "It's time people know the truth." The next day, Darnell stood in front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. He took a deep breath, his hands steady at his sides. "I served my country with pride," he began. "I fought for the freedoms we claim to stand for. But when I came home, I learned that freedom doesn't apply to everyone." The room fell silent. "This isn't just about me," Darnell continued. His voice sharpened. "This is about a system that allows men like Officer Hart to abuse their power. And it's time for that to change." A ripple of applause spread through the room. Darnell's jaw tightened. He didn't know how this would end, but for the first time since the incident, he felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the anger. Hope. The pressure on the police department escalated quickly. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "Justice for Darnell" and "Hold Hart Accountable." The footage of Darnell being pinned to the ground played on an endless loop on news channels. Commentators called for action. Politicians released carefully worded statements, trying to balance outrage with political correctness. But the people weren't interested in empty words. They wanted justice. Darnell sat across from his lawyer in a small office downtown. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa Carter, flipped through a file of evidence. "Hart has a record," she said, sliding a paper across the desk. 10 complaints of excessive force. 5 involving racial profiling, all swept under the rug. Darnell's jaw clenched. "And they let him keep his badge?" Lisa leaned back. "Thin blue line," she said bitterly. "But this time they screwed up. They underestimated you." Darnell's eyes darkened. "How so?" Lisa smiled. "You're not just another statistic. You're a decorated Navy SEAL. You fought for this country. People care about that." A week later, the police department announced a formal hearing to address the public outcry. Officer Hart, dressed in his uniform, entered the hearing room with his chin held high. His eyes scanned the room with disdain, confident that the department would protect him. After all, they always had before. Darnell sat across from him, calm and steady. Lisa sat beside him, her hand resting on a thick folder of evidence. The panel of senior officers sat at the front of the room, flanked by attorneys and press. Hart's lawyer spoke first, trying to spin the incident as a misunderstanding. Officer Hart believed the vehicle was stolen due to a miscommunication from dispatch. "Bullshit," Lisa said, standing. "Dispatch never called in a stolen vehicle." Hart's jaw twitched. He shot Darnell a venomous look, but Darnell didn't flinch. The panel called Darnell to speak. He stood, his broad frame imposing as he walked toward the microphone. His voice was calm but sharp. "I served this country for over a decade. I put my life on the line for the freedoms we claim to value. And when I came home, I was treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin." Hart scoffed from his seat. "Oh, come on." Darnell's gaze snapped toward him, eyes blazing. "Shut your mouth." The room fell silent. Hart's smirk faltered. Darnell continued. "Officer Hart targeted me because he saw a black man in a nice car and assumed I didn't belong there. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice." Murmurs rippled through the room. The panel shifted uncomfortably. Lisa stepped forward, handing a folder to the lead officer. "This is a record of Hart's misconduct. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. You knew about it, and you let him keep his badge." The lead officer's face paled. Hart's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but the damage was already done. Darnell leaned toward the microphone. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been abused by a system designed to protect men like Hart." The panel's chairperson hesitated. Then he sighed. "Officer Hart." Hart sat straighter. "You are hereby stripped of your badge and dismissed from the department, effective immediately." Hart's mouth opened in protest, but the chairperson raised a hand. "Get out." As Hart rose, his face burning with rage and humiliation, Darnell watched him without emotion. Hart's eyes flashed with hatred, but Darnell didn't care. He had already won. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as the news broke. Reporters shouted questions at Darnell as he stepped outside. "How do you feel?" someone called out. Darnell's gaze remained steady. "Like justice finally showed up." A fellow Navy SEAL stepped forward and clapped Darnell on the shoulder. "Proud of you, brother." For the first time in weeks, Darnell allowed himself to smile. He wasn't finished yet, but this was a start. Stripped of his power, Jason Hart confronted a brutal reality. His identity, built on prejudice and arrogance, had shattered. Publicly shamed, he realized the depth of his hatred and cowardice. The community breathed easier knowing he could no longer hide behind authority to terrorize others. Darnell, now hailed as a hero, chose not revenge, but reconciliation, dedicating himself to mentoring young men